Imagine standing on a beach in Newport, Rhode Island, on a morning in 1750. Nothing seems unusual. The harbor is familiar, ships are expected, fishermen are going about their work. Then someone looks toward the water. A sailing vessel is approaching. At first, it looks like any other merchant ship returning from the Atlantic. But then people notice something wrong. The ship is heading toward the beach. Its sails are still set, and nobody appears to be steering. People on shore watch, expecting the vessel to crash. But somehow it avoids the rocks. It continues toward Easton's beach and comes gently ashore. People rush toward it. They climb aboard and discover something that should not be possible. The ship is there. The cargo is there. The animals are there. But the captain and crew are gone. Not dead on the deck. Not hiding below. Gone. And there is one detail that makes the mystery even stranger. The ship's longboat is missing, which means someone took it. The question is, why would an experienced crew abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship just miles from home? And what happened to them after they left? Almost 3 centuries later, we still don't have the answer. The vessel was called the Sea Bird. She was a merchant brig associated with Newport merchant Isaac Steele, and she was commanded by Captain John Huxham. Her voyage had taken her toward the Bay of Honduras. By the autumn of 1750, she was on her way back toward Newport. And this is important. The Sea Bird was not some unknown vessel that appeared from nowhere. People were expecting her. A vessel had reportedly encountered the Sea Bird shortly before the incident, and the ship was known to be on its homeward voyage. Historical accounts describe Captain Huxham and his crew as being close to Newport when everything suddenly went wrong. That makes what happened next even harder to explain. Because the crew weren't hundreds of miles from civilization. They were almost home. And then the ship came ashore without them. People near Easton's beach watched as the Sea Bird approached. She came in under sail. There was no obvious sign that the ship had been destroyed. No spectacular wreck. No burned-out deck. No obvious battle. Instead, the vessel eventually grounded on the beach. And when people boarded her, they found something deeply unsettling. The ship appeared to have been abandoned suddenly. Historical accounts describe the cabin table as being set and a fire burning in the galley with a kettle over it. One account says a dog and cat were found aboard. The longboat, however, was gone. There was no crew. No Captain Huxham. No sailors. No explanation. And there was no confirmed wreckage of the missing longboat. The men simply disappeared. The surviving historical record doesn't tell us exactly what happened in their final moments. And that distinction matters, because over the next century, the story would become increasingly dramatic. But the basic mystery was already disturbing enough. A real ship had come home. Its people had not. Now, imagine investigators standing on that deck. If the ship had been attacked, where were the attackers? If there had been a mutiny, where was the evidence? If a storm had destroyed the vessel, why was the ship still largely intact? And if the crew had simply disappeared, why was the longboat missing? That was the clue everyone kept coming back to. The longboat was not just another piece of equipment. For sailors in the 18th century, a boat like that could mean survival. It was a way to leave the ship if something went catastrophically wrong. So the missing longboat strongly suggests that the crew did not simply vanish from the deck. At some point, they got into that boat. But that creates an even bigger question. What convinced them to leave? Because from everything discovered afterward, the Sea Bird had survived. The crew had not. the simplest explanation may also be the most tragic. The crew could have believed the seabird was in immediate danger. Remember the technology of 1750. There was no engine, no GPS, no radar, no radio. A sailing vessel approaching unfamiliar or dangerous water depended on wind, charts, landmarks, depth measurements, and human judgment. A mistake near shore could become fatal very quickly. Imagine the crew suddenly realizing that the ship was being carried toward breakers or dangerous shallows. They may have believed the seabird was about to run aground. If they thought the ship was doomed, abandoning her in the longboat might have seemed like the safest option. That would explain the missing boat. It would explain why the crew left. And it would explain why they were never seen again. But there is a brutal irony. The seabird didn't die. She came ashore. She survived. The crew may have escaped from the danger they believed was about to destroy them, only to enter an even more dangerous situation. An open boat. The Atlantic. No shelter. No certainty that they could return. And no way to know that the ship they had abandoned was about to survive. It's a perfectly plausible chain of events. But there is a problem. We don't know that this is what happened. There is no surviving testimony from the crew. No one came back to tell the story. And the longboat itself was never recovered. So the theory explains the evidence, without proving anything. There is another possibility. Maybe there was no dramatic emergency. Maybe there was simply a sequence of ordinary decisions that went horribly wrong. Perhaps someone went into the longboat for a practical reason. Navigation, soundings, inspection, something that seemed completely manageable at the time. The boat moves away from the ship. Then the wind changes. The current shifts. The distance increases. The crew realizes they cannot easily return. And suddenly, a routine maneuver becomes a survival situation. This kind of accident requires no storm, no pirate attack, no supernatural explanation. Just water, wind, distance. And one mistake. The ocean doesn't need a hurricane to kill sailors. Sometimes all it needs is a small boat separated from a larger ship. If that happened to the seabird, the vessel could have continued without them, driven by wind and current toward Newport. And that would explain the most haunting image in the entire case. The crew could have disappeared, while their ship continued sailing toward home. Both explanations depend on something we cannot see. The final moments. That's the missing piece. We know the seabird came ashore. We know the crew was gone. We know the longboat was missing. But between those facts is an enormous blank space. What happened during those final minutes? Did the crew panic? Did the captain order them into the boat? Did the boat separate accidentally? Did they believe the ship was sinking? Did something happen that left no physical evidence? We don't know. And this is exactly where the story began to change. Because as the decades passed, people wanted an answer. And when history doesn't provide one, stories tend to fill the empty space. The seabird became part of Newport's maritime folklore. And eventually, later writers began adding explanations. One particularly dramatic account appeared in 1885, more than a century after the original disappearance. It presented a story involving mutiny and murder. But researchers have pointed out that this later account appears to have been fictionalized, rather than a contemporary eyewitness record. That's a crucial distinction, because once a fictional explanation enters a historical mystery, it can be repeated so many times that people eventually forget where it came from. The seabird doesn't need a murder story. It doesn't need pirates. It doesn't need ghosts. The original event is already extraordinary. A real ship, a real captain, a real crew, a real disappearance, and a real missing longboat. That is enough. There is another detail that makes the story particularly cruel. The Sea Bird did not simply become a forgotten wreck. The vessel was recovered. She was eventually sold and renamed **Beach Bird**. Historical accounts indicate that she continued to make voyages afterward. Think about what that means. The ship that had arrived empty was still useful, still afloat, still capable of carrying people. The vessel survived the mystery. The men who had sailed her did not. And that completely changes the way we should look at the case. The Sea Bird was not a haunted wreck sitting forever on the beach. She became part of another chapter of maritime history. But Captain Huxham and his crew never returned to write theirs. So let's return to that morning. You're one of the sailors aboard the Sea Bird. Newport is close. Home is close. You've survived the Atlantic. You've spent months at sea. And then something changes. Maybe you see dangerous water. Maybe you realize the ship is drifting toward the shore. Maybe the captain believes the vessel is in trouble. Maybe the longboat is lowered for a completely ordinary reason. Or maybe something happens that no surviving record ever captured. You climb into the boat. The Sea Bird remains behind. You expect to return, but you don't. The ship moves away. The distance grows, and eventually, the vessel you thought you were escaping becomes the vessel that survives. Meanwhile, the people who sailed her disappear into history. That's the part we cannot reconstruct, not with certainty. And that is where the Sea Bird mystery ends. Not with a monster, not with a ghost, not with a confirmed murder, but with a blank space where the final explanation should be. It's easy to turn stories like this into ghost ship legends. But Captain John Huxham wasn't a character in a horror story. He was a real person. His crew were real people. They had families. They had homes. They had people waiting for them in Newport. And those people probably expected the Sea Bird to arrive with good news. Instead, the ship arrived without them. Imagine seeing the vessel you've been waiting for appear on the horizon, and then discovering that the people you expected to see on its deck are gone. Their ship came home. Their belongings remained, but the men themselves disappeared. No confirmed final message. No recovered longboat. No survivors. No definitive explanation. And according to the Newport Historical Society's archival catalog, correspondence from witnesses concerning the Sea Bird's arrival at Easton's Beach in 1750 still exists in its collections. So this isn't simply a story invented around a campfire. At its core, something really happened. We just don't know exactly what. Maybe the crew made a terrible decision. Maybe they believed the Sea Bird was about to be destroyed. Maybe the longboat was separated from the ship by wind and current. Maybe there was an emergency we can no longer reconstruct. And maybe there was another explanation entirely. But one thing is certain. The Sea Bird reached Newport. Her crew did not. And that leaves us with the question that has survived for nearly 3 centuries. What made a group of experienced sailors leave their ship when that ship was still capable of bringing itself home? Perhaps they thought they were escaping death. Perhaps they were simply caught by a chain of small mistakes. Or perhaps the final minutes of the Sea Bird's voyage contain a clue that disappeared with the men who lived them. We can examine the ship. We can examine the records. We can separate the later legends from the earlier evidence. But we cannot ask the people who were there. They took the answer with them. And somewhere off the coast of Rhode Island, an empty longboat may once have carried the final chapter of the sea bird story. The ship came home. The crew vanished. And after all these years, we still don't know why.